It's my pleasure to welcome Ralf Goff and Glenn Korn to the Cipher Brief studio. Both of you are joining us from Kyiv in Ukraine, and you've been there traveling for several days now, seeing different parts of the country. I wonder, and Ralf, maybe we start with you, what your impression is from the Ukrainian perspective on the ground, given everything in the headlines and all of the back and forth and sort of stress about how a deal might be coming together.
Sure, Suzanne. First of all, I just want to say that Glenn and I are not conjoined twins. We're just sitting very close together, but sometimes it just feels that way.
Fair enough.
So, look, there's a plethora of statements coming out from the Trump administration now, right? And yes, it has caused a lot of consternation here in Ukraine. I mean, if you think the Europeans are freaked out, the Ukrainians are freaked out as well. But, you know, this is vintage President Trump, right? He says what's on his mind. And if I have any criticism for him at this stage, it's just that the message needs from his team, I think, needs to be better coordinated. But, you know, in the meantime, you know, what we have been telling our Ukrainian colleagues is that wait for the actions, not the words.
What are your Ukrainian colleagues telling you? I mean, what is top of mind concern for them, Glenn?
So, I mean, you know, there's outrage, shock, disappointment. But on the other hand, I've had a lot of Ukrainians come up and say things like, well, of course, the mineral, you know, he'd be interested in minerals. It's fair. It allows us to pay for the largesse as opposed to just being, you know, the recipients of free aid, right? The Ukrainians are very proud people. They don't like the idea of being a debtor nation, right? They like the idea of being able to pay their way. So I've actually heard from a lot of people they're in favor of that. They don't see it as some sort of cynical deal. They see it as like, well, of course, you know, the Americans expect to be paid for this stuff, right? And then others have also expressed that, you know, quietly behind the scenes, they kind of say, hey, look, you know, the war's gone on a long time. We don't have the manpower to continue it indefinitely, right? There are polls that I don't know how public they are. We're actually meeting with some people who do polling in the future to get more details, but anywhere between 60 and 70% of the population want the war to stop, right?
Yeah.
Now, that said, they don't want it just halted under, you know, any conditions. They're looking for their sovereignty. They're looking for, you know, to salvage what they can of their territory. And frankly, there's an element there they want to see Putin punished. But there are people here who look at it from a realistic point of view and understand that all those things are going to have to be subject to what I would say a range of outcomes.
Yeah. Glenn, you and Ralf were there with a Cipher Brief with General David Petraeus last September. People were already kind of whispering about what a deal or a settlement might look like, and that was even before the U.S. election. So they've kind of been acclimating, I guess, themselves to the idea that they're not going to get all of their territory back. But they were always really focused on the security guarantees that they needed with any deal. Is that what you're still hearing on the streets? A lot of people talking about what that security guarantee might look like?
Yeah, I mean, people definitely want to know that they understand, and they're very concerned with the fact that Russia will probably make another play to take more territory or to take their sovereignty from them in a few years. They believe that any break in the fighting now, and as Ralf said, most of the people we speak to, they want this war to end. They're tired of fighting. And by the way, they didn't start the war. They didn't ask for this war. They've done a great job protecting themselves and their country, but they want it to end, and justly so. They want a fair ending. They don't want Putin to walk away with the victory or to be rewarded for what he's done. And in terms of guarantees for security, they're open to different ideas, but they are definitely looking for someone to help them protect their sovereignty and to stop Putin from doing this in the future, or whoever replaces Putin in Russia in the future, because they have a long history, an ugly history, like some of their neighbors do, with Russia's aggressive behavior. And one thing I'd say on the comments coming out of the Munich Security Conference and from Washington, I think there's a lot of confusion. Some things that are being said are welcome. For example, when the vice president mentioned, you know, the force would be, or military force would be on the table, I think they'd like to hear that. And as Ralf said, when it comes to the mineral deal, almost everybody I've spoken with have said, yes, we're open to that. We actually like the idea, because the message we keep getting is we want direct U.S. involvement here. We want Americans on the ground If it's not going to be U.S. troops, we want U.S. businesses here. We need them here. We need the investment, and we need the experience and mentorship from American companies and American leaders in the business world in reconstructing our country, which has been devastated by this war.
The future of national security is here. Introducing the Cipher Brief's NatSec Edge Conference, June 5th through 6th, 2025 in Austin, Texas. Join leaders from intelligence, defense, private industry, and investment as they explore the innovations shaping tomorrow's world. Gain critical insights, connect with top minds, and shape the future of security in an interconnected world. Don't just witness the future, be a part of it. Secure your spot now at natsekedge.com.
Yeah. But look, gentlemen, I have to be real with you. I mean, both of you have extensive experience in Russia, and as part of that, it's really your job to understand President Putin. So it seems to me like without the right security guarantee, that it is highly likely that Russia and Putin may be back at some point. Is it realistic to think that? Like, is it just fear or is it actually reality?
It's reality. I mean, mixed with fear, well-founded fear. But look, the outcome of this deal will be only the first phase, right? Whatever stops the guns from firing. The next phase will be, what does Putin and his team do as a follow-up, right? Personally, I think they'll reinvigorate their activities in the gray zone, right, across Europe. I think they'll look to keep the situation destabilized, but they have to be careful so they don't, wreck the deal, right? In the meantime, it also remains to be seen the economic cost on Russia, right? And frankly, I think as the dust settles, if there's a ceasefire and a peace, as the dust settles, the Russian people will start focusing more on their economy as opposed to the war itself. And when they start to realize the extent of the damage to their economy, I think Vladimir Putin may have some explaining to do. Right? And in the end, any settlement that's arranged, the only settlement that'll work is a settlement where both sides are unhappy. So there'll be problems for the Russians, just as there will be problems for the Ukrainians, no matter how this deal is settled.
Long history of tension there. Glenn, how do you feel about that question? Is it realistic to think that Putin will very likely be back if there isn't a deal reached that has robust security guarantees?
Absolutely. His record up to date has been one of using aggression to get what he wants, or intimidation. And no matter what happens, if there's a ceasefire tomorrow, Suzanne, there's going to be a continued use of active measures of covert influence, covert action in Ukraine to try and direct things in the way that Putin wants. There's no doubt about that, and the Ukrainians are very well aware of that, and they're going to need help protecting themselves from that. I think that's one reason why they say one of the most important things that can happen after the fighting stops is for some investment and financial assistance from the West, from the U.S., to help their economy. And by the way, we're talking a lot about Putin, but we shouldn't get so focused on him because they have their own internal problems. And they are very realistic about, everyone we've spoken with has talked about what's going to happen when all the veterans come back from the front, how they're going to deal with the psychological challenges, medical problems, finding people good jobs. They obviously don't want a brain drain when the borders open after the end of a conflict. And of course, the political future, because, there's a lot of internal dynamics too, and maybe tensions growing. You referred to the September trip we did. That back then there was almost no talk about like other political parties. There was almost complete unity. What I'm seeing now is some of the other political parties or politicians are saying we want our chance to run the country, and there's a tension growing from that. We have to be very careful. I'm sure the Russians want to hear that and they want to promote that, but we should also be careful not to assume that when one Ukrainian official says we don't like the current regime, or we want a chance that's Moscow giving them an order to do that. Right? So there are some natural dynamics here that we have to pay attention to and be respectful to, I think.
I think both of you were with me when we attended a meeting with leaders at the SBU who were giving a rather sobering readout about Russian activities there, Russian activities to influence how the Ukrainians feel about this war, to sort of keep reminding them of the cost, maybe in efforts to get them to give up.
The Ukrainians are aware of the cost, Suzanne. What about the West? I mean, how many accidental anchor drags will the West tolerate in the Baltic Sea, destroying critical undersea infrastructure, right? Look, Putin takes his cues from the West. And if there's no responses to that, right, you can guarantee, I agree with Glenn, when the guns go silent, right, Putin will find ways to attack the West, from, like I said earlier, in the gray zone. Right, that stuff I think we'll see. No matter what settlement in Greece, I think we'll have to double our vigilance there because of the lack of a Western response to date.
And gentlemen, you just come from Odessa, which is very close to one of the major front lines of this war, not far at all. What is the sense in Odessa? I mean, people obviously would like to have an end to the fighting, but is the fight still in them? I mean, give us a sense of what it's like.
Oh, no, the
there.
fight is still in the people. And I can tell you, we were on the street yesterday, Sunday morning. We were walking down the street with our Ukrainian friends, and an air raid went off, and people were pushing their carriages and out for Sunday, shopping or having coffee, and nobody went to the bunkers. And I asked the Ukrainian guy we were with, I said, what do you think we should do? He said, go have a beer. So the fight is here, and I don't mean to be like these people. They're still resilient. They're ready to fight for their country. They are not going to surrender. They want to end to the war, but they don't want to give up their sovereignty.
Yeah.
Or when we were up in Sumy, which is very close to the front, like the other day, and visiting hospitals there with a volunteer group that was delivering medical assistance. We went to this one hospital that's been hit by missiles several times, right? It was attacked in the early days of the war and destroyed, and the staff, after a month of occupation, they started rebuilding. After they had largely finished the rebuild, the Russians hit it with a missile again, right? So they had to rebuild it another time, right? They're up there now within, 15, 20 kilometers of the border, and they're continuing to rebuild. They're looking to the future, right? They have one eye cocked on Russia and one eye on the West, and they're doing everything they can to try and rebuild and improve the lives of their people. I mean, the mayor there was bragging about the fact that they were finally going to open school in March after something like 3 years, right? Because they finally have a school that has, thanks to the work of Western aid organizations, has proper shelter underneath it.
Yeah.
Right,
Gentlemen, I want to ask
you mentioned Odessa, but I mean,
Yeah.
just look at the potential there, like for investment, for business. It's incredible, right? It's a beautiful place
Across the country.
And again, the Ukrainians we met with, they welcome that. They love the idea of Americans coming in and playing a role in helping them rebuild.
Well, I want to ask you exactly about that, because we all have seen firsthand sort of the technology development that's been happening there since this war began, as Ukrainians responded, really not in the way Russia expected, but they responded with the innovation and the intellect and the drive to use technology to their advantage because they knew they didn't have manpower on their side. So let me ask you, like, when you're thinking about the future for Ukraine and you're seeing the technological innovation that's been happening there, are Ukrainians hopeful that this is maybe a solid future for them, and maybe this is one of their own self-created security guarantees, is how technologically strong they will be when it comes to defense?
Yes, and they were looking for ways to build their economy after the war, things that they can do. We've heard many of them talk about being able, being a producer of arms, high-tech stuff. And I would again say, like, for members of the administration and for the American people, this is a country we want on our side. We don't want them on the other side, because they are very good at what they're doing. They're very talented, and unfortunately, they've had to be very talented at killing people to protect their country. We don't want this country on the wrong side of the United States. We need them as partners.
Mm-hmm. Closing thoughts from both of you, as I know that your trip to Kyiv is not over yet. You've got a couple of more meetings coming up this week that will be rather significant. But takeaways from both of you so far.
Takeaways, resilience is the key word here. We've seen it everywhere at all different levels. The initial shock of these latest political developments will wear off as the details come out, right? Through it all, there will be resilience. And the other is, frankly, I take some pleasure in the outrage in Europe because they're stepping up. For the first time, the Europeans are going to have to, as we say, put on their big boy pants and take charge, right? And I think, to date, the Europeans have shown, varying degrees of commitment to the fight here, but definitely, they need to show more. They need to be prepared to take on a bigger burden, particularly if the United States decides not to take the leading role, right? Because the peace is important, but the rebuilding will be even more important. And that will be, I think, largely a European show.
I would say, I think what we have to be very aware of is that the focus in Washington is shifting. The Europeans need to understand that we are very concerned about the Western Hemisphere, a region which has gotten very little attention or has not gotten enough attention from the U.S., from Washington for many years. For many of us, it's hard to say that because we did Europe, we did Eurasia, we did the Middle East. We feel very comfortable in this part of the world. I think some of the reaction we're seeing now is people that are not comfortable because it's a whole new issue that has to be tackled, but it has to be tackled. We've allowed the Chinese to gain way too much leverage in our backyard. We have a lot of issues in Latin America that we need to take care of and project our influence instead of allowing other people to project their influence. And I think, as Ralf said, this is the time for the Europeans to step up. But we also have to understand that if we're going to ask the Europeans to step up and carry their full share, that we have to let them make decisions sometimes and step back. We're not always going to be the ones that get to make the final call because we often have a hard time with that.
That's a good point.
Right? And I always give the example of Turkey. The Turks do things, and then people in Washington get upset. But they do things, for example, in Syria, that are in our best interest. And they did it themselves with their money and their influence and their capabilities. When that happens, we shouldn't automatically react and say, oh, we should have made the decision. We should say, okay, you're our partners. You made a decision. We're going to support you. And we're going to have to live with that because we can't be the world's policeman. And we need partners to help police the world.
Former senior CIA officers Ralf, Goff, and Glenn Korn joining us from an undisclosed hotel in Kyiv. Really want to thank you so much, and we're looking forward to continuing to check in with you through your travels there. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Sam.